So I've asked my good friend Rey Ramsey. Rey Ramsey was our keynoter in 2011, and everybody wanted to vote for him. He wasn't running for office, but we were all inspired at that time. I asked him to come back with his experience and background as an activist, as an entrepreneur. He's now starting a venture fund. He just spent a number of years running TechNet, the most significant technology advocate organization in Washington, D.C., working directly with the CEOs of Cisco and IBM and all the large and mid-sized tech companies. As a community activist, I asked Rey to start us off with the following question. How do you go about making major change happen? Rey Ramsey.
Thank you, sir. I had to do the most important thing was to know where the clock was so that I don't overshoot that. I am deeply honored to be here, and for those of you from Colombia and from all over the world, I hope that you will get as much from this as I'm getting from it. This was worth all of our time, taking times out of our busy lives. I want to share a few things with you. When I was here in 2011, I spoke about a social venture that I was involved with, one of several social ventures, and it's a school in North Carolina. And I talked about this school because I was using it as a model of something that could be done, that we were carving out a little gym in the southern part of the United States in North Carolina. A rural school in a county called Bertie County. And Bertie County is probably the second most tobacco-dependent county in North Carolina. And I'm going to share with you what has happened with that story because something significant happened just Saturday vis-a-vis the school. So while I was taking a bike ride, thinking about what I was going to say, I got a text. I shouldn't be looking at my text while I was biking, but that's another issue. This time I survived the trip. But I got something back, and I'm going to share it with you at the end of my remarks, and I think you'll see how all of the pieces weave together. This topic is very near and dear to me, but I want to give it a little bit of a twist. When people think about doing social innovation, all of us who are in that space think about transformation. What systems we're going to transform, what societies we're going to transform, indeed what worlds we're going to transform, outer space, the Earth. And what I want to talk about is the most important part of that transformation. And that's the transformation of self. Because I believe that in order to do any of this work, the most important transformation comes from the inside out. And so you'll hear about the things that we need to do externally, and they are critical. But there's nothing more critical than the inside journey. And I want to share a few things about that. There are three things I want you to think about. One is values. The second is people. And the third is opportunity. Those are three critical elements for social transformation, and it involves self. And I'm going to share a few stories with you that touch on people, that touch on values, and that touch on opportunity. Without those three things, you can't get it done. In terms of values, that can be a loaded word, but nevertheless, it has a universal reach. I got the opportunity to meet a great social transformer a number of years ago. I started my career in Oregon, working in a large law firm. And I had a transformation in my life because a very dear friend of mine lost her mother and her father in the span of 3 weeks. And I was going to that funeral. I remember driving in the car and saying, I can't just be a wealthy lawyer. There's nothing wrong with lawyers, and there's certainly nothing wrong with rich lawyers. But I didn't want to only be a wealthy lawyer. And at this funeral, I met this woman called Christy. And Christy started telling me about an organization, which at the time I said, that's impossible. And it was an organization that you have come to know as Habitat for Humanity, which is in about 110 countries. And it was started by an individual by the name of Millard Fuller, who was a wealthy lawyer, who gave up his wealth to start this venture because he visited Africa and he saw this shared housing model in Africa. And he decided that that could happen in the United States. So I met Millard as a young lawyer, and he did some things that I wanted to emulate. One, he started an organization from scratch. Two, he gave up something because that was part of his transformation. And three, he lived it. And so I got the privilege of working with him as a volunteer and him coming to my office and saying, Mr. Ramsey is going to be my lawyer. And so years later, as I worked my way up the corporate ladder and I stayed involved with Habitat, I was sworn in to be the chairman of Habitat for Humanity International. And we were in a town hall meeting similar to this, and Millard said, I think Mr. Ramsey is going to be the finest chairman we've ever had in this organization as we continue to go global. Well, something happened along the way. I was in this job for 2 months, and I received a phone call at 9 o'clock one evening. And when your general counsel calls you at your house at 9 o'clock in the evening, you get a little nervous. And she said to me, are you sitting down? And I said, Regina, why are you? I'm home. Of course I'm sitting down. And she said, well, I'm here with the head of HR. Now, if you have the lawyer calling you and the head of HR, and it's 9 o'clock at night, So she said, we have an allegation. We have an allegation of misconduct. And unfortunately, it was misconduct about my hero, Millard, who started this incredible organization. And I can't share everything with you because of confidentiality, but this was a significant issue that got President Carter involved, got us to get involved in his home. And it tested every value that my mother and father ever instilled in me. But I had every temptation to sweep it under the rug because Millard was my hero. And I had people saying we should do that. And we had disagreements on the board because the board was made up of people from all over the world that viewed this kind of misconduct in different ways and said, what's the big deal? People just hug each other. But it was much more than that. And over the course of 8 months, as we battled back and forth, as I had to be, there was a website that went up, which I called the hate site, because every morning I would wake up and see something written about me, prayer vigils being held at the headquarters about me, against me, and the temptation to pull away. And I kept saying to our board, values, values. What do we value? This transcends a person. This is a movement. When it was all said and done, I had to pick up the phone one Wednesday, which I'll never forget, and say to Millard that he was removed. So I'll forever be known in that organization as the person who removed the founder. And what I did on my last day in office was I introduced the new CEO, introduced a new strategic plan, and moved the headquarters to Atlanta. We lost no affiliates, we lost no corporate donors, and the organization has thrived. Values are at the core of any transformation. That experience was transformative for me, and I'll never forget it because I'd always hoped for a reconciliation. But in this world, I didn't get that reconciliation because I attended 3 years ago Millard's funeral and didn't get to reconcile with him. But he's still one of my heroes. So I speak of him today as one of my heroes, and as like any of us, we're all flawed. And we need people around us that remind us about the values of what's important and what's significant in any transformative project. Because there is a temptation when you get the accolades and people start making it about you. And you've got to remember it's not about you, it's about the cause. And that requires that continuous look at self so that you can keep moving forward. You can't scale unless you're scaling the right way on the inside of yourself and moving forward. People. We do things not as isolated causes, but it's by and for and through other people. I view people through the two lenses. People who are examples that I can point to in my life, and people who are mentors that I can go to in my life, and they're there to help. And there's no such thing as a self-made person. I always say if somebody says that they're a self-made man, they're either delusional or they lie, because there's no such thing. It's all about people. And I've had the opportunity to work with extraordinary people and continue to work with extraordinary people who I look to for their advice and for their counsel. When I was in Oregon, I had a great opportunity that was given to me, and again, the issue of opportunity. You can have the best idea in the world. If someone doesn't say yes to you and give you an opportunity, you're never going to be able to get it done. So at a very young age, we had just a hard-charging governor in Oregon, and I was in that law firm hoping to change the world and change my life. And one day, this governor asked me, and I was 29 years old, and he asked me to take over housing for the state of Oregon so that we could house the poor. And he gave me an opportunity. And I remember a story that goes along with that. Talk about keeping you humble. I was in a restaurant one morning after it had been announced that I was going to be the housing secretary, and everybody was sort of dazzled by the fact of race, and because there weren't a lot of black people in Oregon, still aren't, by the issue of race and the issue of age. And I was sitting in a restaurant as a kid, and I remember feeling pretty good about myself, and a friend of mine said, "Ray, did you see the paper today?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "You're in it." And of course, I smiled. But there was one clue that it might not be what I wanted, because my friend left the restaurant really quickly. And I thought, So I get the newspaper while I'm sitting there with a cup of tea, and I read a headline. The headline was this, and I'll never forget it. Quote, "It shows you how little the governor cares about housing. So put this person who knows nothing." That was the headline. There was my face also. So that was one of those times. Fortunately, this was before we had the internet, because that would have been everywhere. So I was grateful that I'm a little older, that it wasn't in the internet, because that would have been everywhere. And I don't know if you can find it. I'm not sure, and I'm not going to tell you the name of the paper. But so again, things have a way of sort of bringing you back to reality. And I sat in the restaurant. What I did was I went out and I looked at my wallet and I said, "How much money do I have?" And then I said, "Where are all the corner stores?" I bought about 25 papers and got rid of them, recycled them, but got rid of them so that fewer people would see my face under that headline. So what it required of me was to go out and meet people and talk to people and ask for their help. And I'll never forget, in some of the early meetings, and the housing advocates were angry with me because they had some heroine that had been working the housing issues for about 20 years, and they wanted her. And I went and met with her. She never smiled. But they said that they wanted to get a trust fund, flexible money for affordable housing. And I asked, "Well, how long have you guys been battling to do this?" And she said, "Well, for about 15 years, we've been fighting the good fight." And I was like, "Have you ever won?" And I was like, "No." And I was like, "Okay." And so I made my plank that we would get this trust fund. And then I discovered all the barriers in a legislative process that you would run into, the bankers, the realtors, and all the people. Well, again, I didn't know enough to have something get in my way. So what I did was something very basic, which is critical, which is about bringing people together. And we created what was called the Housing Lobby Coalition. And I got the bankers and the realtors and the advocates and everyone in the room, and we cut a deal. And we went to the legislature. And I used to go to the legislature banging on the table, talking about people's lives and painting a picture, not about housing units, but about people and their lives. I put 14 pieces of legislation in front of the legislation that year as this kid that was in that paper, and we passed 14 pieces of legislation, and that legislation exists today. And it was because of that group of people that we brought together, but it was because of what I had to go through internally, being laughed at, being ridiculed, but sticking by the course and remembering the values that I refer to my parents having instilled. But it takes even more than that sometimes, again, when we think of people, opportunities, and we think of values. Because yesterday, when we were doing that incredible exercise, and I was sharing with my partner she asked me, "Well, where'd you grow up?" And I said, "A small town," and she asked me more questions, and we were going on this course as though it were an idyllic experience. And I shared with her, I said, "Well, it kind of wasn't." Because I said, when we moved into this neighborhood in the 60s, I remember something being spray painted on the entryway to the neighborhood when we moved in. 3 letters. And I turned to my mom and I said, what does K, K, and K stand for? Because that's what they spray painted when we moved into the neighborhood. And we were isolated. And she said, it's something very bad, and I'll explain it later. So over a course of time, I decided that all I could do well, because of that isolation, was fight people. I was pretty good at it, too. I never came home with a bloody mouth. I delivered a few. But the power of people is what this is about, because all I could do was fight, had no sense of pride, but there was one extraordinary person. Her name was Mrs. Elizabeth Pfeiffer. And inexplicably one day, of course she said, stay after class. That would have been normal, because it would have been any number of things that I would have deserved detention for. So I figured, which was I caught with? Stealing, fighting, whatever. And she said to me, and it was inexplicable at the time, she said, Ray, you're the smartest boy in the class. So I went home and I told my father. My father's a loving guy, but he looked at me like, that's odd, because how are you the smartest boy in the class when all you get is D's and the only thing you get is an A in gym? So my father was looking at me like quizzically, like, that's great. But my mother did something that some of you may relate to who are a little bit older. She had purchased something that you pay for back in the day every single month. They were called encyclopedias. And she bought the Encyclopedia Britannica and set it there. And there were no such things as home offices. It was the kitchen. And we sat there, and because of what Mrs. Pfeiffer said, I read the encyclopedia every single day. And I had not raised my hand for 4 years in class because I used to get laughed at. I was in remedial reading. And one day, Mrs. Pfeiffer asked a question in class. And you know, there was a smart girl, her name was Denise. And you know, there's always one, and she always got everything right. Always, always, always. And so this question got asked, and Denise didn't raise her hand. And I was like, whoa, Denise doesn't know? I knew. And the answer, and I'll never forget it, and Mrs. Pfeiffer said, what's an ICBM? And I raised my hand. Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. And everybody looked at me like, whoa, and I kind of liked that. I liked the way that felt. And that moment was freeze-framed in me forever. And what it froze in me is several thoughts. One is, again, back to opportunity. You have to say yes to someone else, the way Mrs. Pfeiffer said yes to me. But you also have to be willing to have people who will say yes and be available for people to say yes to you, because there's no self-made person. And because of her, she said yes to me, and it made all of the difference. So when I spoke here about this school a number of years ago that we started, I was in rural North Carolina doing some work, some community development work, and I hadn't seen poverty quite like this in a rural sense. One of the young boys took me to, because he kept talking about, we feed the dog under the house. And I was like, what are you talking about? So there was a trailer park close to this place that we were looking at for the school. And what he meant was, he could pull the rug up inside of the house. There was an opening in the floor of the house, and they would feed the dog through it because it didn't have a complete floor. And so we started this technology-based program there, and the county supervisor said, just take these boys, they've been discarded. And I kind of called them the discarded boys. And I shared their story a little bit with you in 2011, and I said then that I said to the young gentleman, I'm going to tell your story all over the world, because what you're doing is extraordinary. We set up this program basically to get people off the street because of the gangs, because they were being discarded everywhere, because I wanted to fill that room with Mrs. Pfeiffers who could say yes to people so they would be able to have opportunities in their lives. But it's a day-to-day struggle, because at the end of the day, it's about choice. It's about the choice that the individual makes. And so these young gentlemen, many of them have never been out of North Carolina. You have people who are 18 years old reading at a third grade reading level. Just on Saturday, I got a text, like I said, which caused me to get off my bike. and caused me to reflect about what I was going to say today. Timothy, I won't say his full name, he was 19 years old, 4 weeks away from turning 20, was shot in the head and left for dead in a tobacco field. His son is 11 years old. And Timothy, unfortunately, didn't make the right choices, didn't get through. And he won't get to see his son. It's a reminder of how high the stakes are, because he was involved with the gang, he stole from someone that he shouldn't have, and it cost him his life. And so when I saw that on Saturday, I wanted to share Timothy's story, because ultimately we're all part of a long, unbroken chain of people, just simply people, with a common element, which is human aspiration. Timmy had aspirations. He saw himself doing many great things. He wasn't exposed to everything he needed to be exposed to. I feel a little guilty that the program hasn't been larger and we hadn't been able to do more for him. Timmy needed more people to say yes to him in his life, but Timmy needed to say yes to himself. And that's where that journey of personal transformation comes. So we can have our business plans, we can raise money, we can know how to make the pitch, we can build a great product. All of those things matter. But ultimately, we're people. We need an opportunity. And we've got to help each other. And that, to me, is the lesson that I wanted to impart to you. It weighs heavy on my heart when I think of him. Every moment at this conference, I've been thinking of him. I have his picture of his son in my wallet. We've got to find the Timmys and the Anns and the Mohammeds and the other people all over the world, and we've got to provide an opportunity for them. And we've got to work hard to not make it about ourselves. I always get a little embarrassed to get up on the stage because I don't want to talk about myself. Because I've been very fortunate because I had Mrs. Pfeiffer. I had the encyclopedia that my mother bought. And with those opportunities, we really can and must do things for other people. Now, I'm going to continue to tell his story. One of the things that I did when I left here, and I reflected on the fact that I said I would tell the story of these young boys in this school. It's called The Hive, and after like the Beehive, because I started a website years ago designed for low literacy, low income individuals to get life-sustaining resources called The Beehive. And the young boys in this school, and it's a boys' school, called the school The Hive. And they flew a flag out there and they called it The Hive. So I went to a friend of mine in Hollywood, Robert Townsend, who's an actor and director and producer. And I went with him with the dream to tell this story. And I told him I wanted to turn this into a movie. So we got Loretta Devine and a number of other major stars in Hollywood, and we produced a movie. We sold it to BET. It's available, so it's called The Hive if you ever get a chance. It's well worth looking at. It's well worth showing in different schools in different settings. Because what I said at the time, because Robert said to me, well, what story do you want to tell? And I said, it's ultimately about choice. And it's about getting to that fork in the road and what will define which choice that we take. And you don't know the choice that the protagonist in the movie takes until the very end. And that's what the story is about. And life imitating art, because that's just what played out on Saturday. So as Robert Frost would say, sometimes we get to this fork in the road and we have to make a choice. And very often it's the road less traveled by. And that really does make all of the difference. So when you want to scale, when you want to move things forward, remember the people that you need to mentor, that you need as examples. Remember to give opportunity and to seize opportunity. And most importantly, it's about values. I feel privileged and honored to share those stories with you, and I wish you the best on your journey. Take the road less traveled. God bless you.
Thank you, Ray. So you could have talked about business plans. I guess you mentioned them. You could have talked about selling your story, values, people, opportunity. But you know, one thing that resonated for me was self-knowledge and humility. We're in an age that is defined by something called YouTube. Maybe we might call it MeTube. We listen to a lot of speeches about how great and fantastic and wonderful we are. And Ray got up and told us we're flawed. Ray got up and told us that it's not about us, it's about other people. And if you're a self-made person, you got a problem. Karl Marx said that a hallmark of post-capitalist society is vanity. He turns out he was right. He was wrong about a few other things, but on that account, the great man was right. Think about society and where we're going. There's nothing wrong with looking good, feeling good, but how are other people looking and feeling? The things that resonated for me from Ray's comments were Mrs. Elizabeth Pfeiffer, and I bet when you say her name, you always say Mrs. And the fact that you remembered that young lady's name, Denise. She had a cousin named a nephew, by the way. If you think about that, you'll... Anyway. And Millard Fuller. I met Millard briefly. I did not know him, but I met him at a conference about 6 months before he died. And I have to say, someone who founds a group like Habitat for Humanity had an aura about him. And he actually talked a little bit about the trauma. It was clear that this was this cloud over his head, but it could not overcome the extraordinary things that he did. We have a tendency to idolize people and determine that they must be therefore perfect because of the wonderful things they've done. And that's clearly not the case. Human aspirations. Thank you, Ray.